when leaders from the Group of Seven Nations, or G7, gathered for a 3-day summit in Hiroshima in May of 2023, they were joined by a unique contingent of leaders from several other nations. The several other nations included India, South Korea, Brazil, and Australia. And the leaders from these nations were joining the G7 leaders in an effort to discuss pressing international issues such as climate change and food security. But the most important theme at play was pushing back against the common enemy, Russia and China. The G7 nations had finally realized the importance of stepping up cooperation with the emerging and developing countries to forge a more united international front on several issues related to China's rising assertiveness and Moscow's rising belligerence. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaur, and today we take a look at the emerging New World Order in the postmodern era and its implications on global polity and economy. The Group of Seven, or G7, started as G6 in 1975 with the United States, France, Italy, Japan, the UK, and West Germany. The primary aim was to provide the non-communist bloc of powerful economies a venue to address pressing economic concerns. And at that time, the pressing economic concern was the recession sparked by the OPEC, namely the oil crisis. Canada joined a year later, making it the G7. But if you look closely at its composition, it almost looks like the Allied powers and the Axis powers from World War II suddenly got together and formed a group. So the two warring factions during World War II suddenly decided to bury the hatchet and come together on a common economic platform to prevent economic shocks from other cartels or the communist bloc. Russia formally joined the group in 1998, making it the G8. It was primarily on the behest of then US President Bill Clinton that Russia got admitted, and Bill Clinton's thinking was that admitting Russia would give some prestige to the country after its collapse, and would also temper some concerns about the West opening up NATO membership to the former Soviet republics in Eastern Europe. But after Russia invaded Crimea in 2014 under President Vladimir Putin, it was placed under suspension from its G8 membership, and as a result, the G8 again became G7. Now, at the time of the inception of G7, their contribution to the global economy was more than 70% in terms of the aggregate GDP. Now, it is down to about 44% of the global economy. And with that number at 44%, the G7 does need the support of a lot of the emerging economies to push forth its agenda. And its primary agenda currently is containing the growth of China, both economically and politically. And the specific initiative from China that is giving the G7 leaders sleepless nights is the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is Chinese President Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy initiative, which is also the world's largest infrastructure program. Essentially, China is trying to build a global trade infrastructure to facilitate global trade with its partner countries, which technically would compete directly with the G7 countries. Since the inception of BRI in 2013, Chinese banks and companies have financed and built several infrastructure items from power plants, railways, highways, telecommunication infrastructure, fiber optic cables to lay out this fundamental trade infrastructure in their partner countries. And who are these partner countries? Essentially, developing countries in the region like Pakistan, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. So China's financial institutions are trying to become the World Bank of this region. Now, the core issue with this initiative is that along with the loans being made to the partner countries, these also come with very strict repayment guidelines. And as the COVID pandemic struck, many of these countries found it difficult to repay these loans, and countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka have found themselves in the middle of a huge debt crisis. And ultimately, the good old International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, has had to intervene to bail these countries out. The bigger underlying agenda behind the BRI, though, is promoting yuan, or the renminbi, as the trade currency alternative to the US dollar. By building the trade infrastructure with its partner countries, China expects yuan to be the currency of choice for trade between these partner countries. In fact, in March of 2023, the yuan became the most widely used currency for cross-border transactions in China for the first time, overtaking the dollar. Though the yuan share of global currency transactions is still very low at 4.5% in March, but the trend is still upward. When it comes to China's cross-border transactions, the yuan share is now at 48.4% versus the dollar share at 46.7%. And this trend is primarily what is giving sleepless nights to the G7 leaders. While the G7 is an alliance of the advanced economies of the world, the BRICS alliance represents the fast-growing economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries represent 43% of the world's population, 16% of the world's trade, and they have a larger share of the world's GDP than the G7. The acronym BRIC for Brazil, Russia, India, and China was coined in 2001 by Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill to refer to these four countries who were then enjoying high rates of economic growth. But from 2009 onwards, these countries came together as a cohesive geopolitical bloc, with South Africa joining in 2010. Coincidentally, each of these countries represent one of the continents, with Brazil representing the Americas, Russia, Europe, India and China, Asia, and South Africa, Africa. In 2014, the BRICS alliance set up its own new development bank to address the financing needs of its member states. Since most of its members represent the third world countries that saw high economic growth, there has been a lot of interest from other growing economies to join BRICS. And some of these economies include Argentina, Egypt, Indonesia, Nigeria, the UAE, etc. And a point to note here is that the new development bank came into existence after the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund failed to carry out governance reforms demanded by the BRICS members. The BRICS alliance has enough monetary muscle, and it is using that to build its base of influence. And it has had some success in that area. In 2021, countries like Egypt, the UAE, Uruguay, and Bangladesh contributed shares to the new development bank. So the interest in joining the BRICS alliance is high, especially from the developing economies. But there are subtle and visible conflicts between the coalition members, especially China and India. China and India have often clashed at their international border, and India has also called out China's debt diplomacy, which has led to huge debt crises in the neighboring Sri Lanka. And of late, Russia, after being sanctioned heavily by the West because of its war in Ukraine, has pushed the coalition towards coming up with an alternative currency to the dollar. And this currency would be used for cross-border trade among the BRICS nations. And there is support for this initiative amongst the BRICS members. Very recently, Brazil's President Lula da Silva said that every night he asks himself why all countries have to base their trade on the dollar. Well, one could argue that this has been conceived in the past. We do have the euro for the eurozone. So what's new? Well, there's one big factor that's different. BRICS is almost a self-sustained, self-sufficient economy. And unlike the euro, which is confined within the geographical boundaries of the eurozone, the BRICS currency would not have any geographical restrictions. So any country could trade with the BRICS alliance, thereby contributing to the range of goods available for trade within the trading partners. So the setup and the groundwork is there. The question is, can it take off? And if it does, what kind of impact will it have to world trade? Another factor in this equation is that there's another country that is globally asserting itself as an economic power. And it might as well be the S in BRICS. I'm talking about Saudi Arabia. In 2016, Saudi Arabia came up with a strategy for economic growth beyond oil, calling it Vision 2030. The aim was to look beyond oil and focus on growth both economically and socially, so it can brand itself as the economic hub of the Middle East and North African region. And this is quite evident in the fact that despite being fossil fuel rich, the Saudi leaders are very keen to boost their green energy credentials through the Middle East Green Initiative. And that brings us to the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is a group of 4 countries: the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. This group was established after the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004 with a primary focus on security issues within the region. But the core problem that this group is trying to solve is China's growing assertiveness in the Pacific. And in line with China being the core issue in that region, the navies of all 4 countries within the Quad participated in their first joint exercise in November of 2020. The Quad has also formed working groups on COVID-19 vaccines, climate change, technological innovation, and supply chain resilience. Supply chain resilience, aka diversifying a supply chain that is heavily dependent upon China. That tells us the focus of the group is not just on the military aspects of the China influence, but also on the economic side. The Indo-Pacific region is a very strategic economic hub. And in 2019 alone, about $1.9 trillion worth of US trade passed through this region. On an average, the region processes about 42% of the world's exports and 38% of the global imports. Among the Quad members, Japan is specifically very heavily dependent upon open sea lanes for its trade with the world. So Japan's biggest concern is China's assertion of sovereignty in the South China Sea, which is of economic and strategic importance to Japan as well. So how do you offset China's influence in that region? Well, for starters, protecting the economies in that region from China's strategic debt trap. So Japan is trying to offer Southeast Asian countries alternative sources of assistance so they can meet their growth targets. Recently, Japan joined with United States and Australia to deepen the funds available for quality infrastructure in that region. So when we talk about the South China Sea, one would think that Philippines, which has an economic stake in the South China Sea, would be another member of the Quad. In fact, one would expect Philippines to be there before India because India doesn't have any strategic assets or aspirations in the South China Sea. Well, it seems like the Quad alliance did realize this gap, and subsequently in June of 2023, very recently, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin met with his counterparts from Japan, Australia, and the Philippines in Singapore. And the primary topic of this get-together was keeping the South China Sea and Indo-Pacific free and open to global trade. So the Quad seems to be pulling together a group of nations who have a common concern against the rise of China in the Pacific. The BRICS seems to be pulling together a coalition of countries which are trying to have an alternate economic bloc, not heavily dependent upon the dollar as the global currency. So the fundamental question remains, is the world turning multipolar? If you were to ask Christine Lagarde, the former MD of the IMF, you would hear a resounding yes. According to Christine Lagarde, the tectonic plates of geopolitics are shifting, and we are witnessing a fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs, with each bloc trying to pull as much of the rest of the world closer to its respective strategic interests and shared values. So what are the implications? Well, the most evident one would be that more and more international debates could end up in a stalemate. Meaning, if each bloc operates within its own trade zone and its own currency, economic sanctions may no longer have even an iota of an effect. Not that they are very effective today, but they could be rendered meaningless. And even more meaningless would become the bipolar UN Security Council. There is, however, a huge silver lining, mainly for the smaller nations who've been rendered inconsequential on the global economic map. With the onset of the new economic blocs like BRICS or Quad, these smaller nations may suddenly find a voice once they align with one of these blocs. Because each economic bloc will try to make the entire bloc economically self-sustainable. And that would mean a solid investment in trade and economic infrastructure across the entire bloc. And it is on that positive note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which European country has had the longest period of peace? Liechtenstein has been neutral since 1866 and has not been involved in a war since its creation in 1719, making it the top contender for the longest period of peace in Europe. So the answer is B, Liechtenstein. Question for the current episode. What was the first dissenting vote or veto cast by China in the United Nations Security Council? Was it A, admission of Bangladesh as a new UN member in 1972, B, admission of South Vietnam as a new UN member in 1975, C, relations between the UN and South Africa in 1974, or D, measures for the maintenance and strengthening of peace and security in Latin America in 1973. Once again, what was the first dissenting vote or veto cast by China in the United Nations Security Council? A, admission of Bangladesh as a new UN member in 1972, B, admission of South Vietnam as a new UN member in 1975, C, relations between the UN and South Africa in 1974, or D, measures for the maintenance and strengthening of peace and security in Latin America in 1973. The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we look at the history of one of humankind's greatest achievements, space exploration, the history and the rivalry generated between various nations as each tried to outdo the other. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.